A young family, a quiet town, a crime so brutal it left seasoned detectives shaken. Keith Dardeen was a devoted husband and father, but one night he and his family were found brutally murdered. When police finally entered their home, what they found defied all logic. A blood-soaked crime scene, a brutality that seemed personal yet utterly unexplainable. And the most horrifying detail? The killer wasn't finished. Decades later, no clear suspect, no solid leads, only fear, unanswered questions, and a warning. If this could happen to the Dardeens, it could happen to anyone. Who would do this, and why? The truth remains buried, but tonight we're uncovering every chilling detail. It was the kind of small-town life most people dream of. Enna, Illinois, a quiet rural town where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. Keith and Elaine Dardeen were the heart of their community. They were loved, they were respected, and they were devoted to each other and their family. Together, they had built a life. Their son Peter had just turned 4, and their baby girl, barely a month old, was the light of their lives. Keith, a hard-working truck driver, and Elaine, a homemaker, had dreams of something more, something bigger. They were making plans to move out of Enna, to leave behind the crime that had begun creeping into their once safe neighborhood. They wanted to start fresh, a new place, a new chapter, but those plans would never come to fruition. It was November 18, 1987, an ordinary Wednesday morning in the small town of Enna, Illinois. But for the Dardeen family, this would be a day that marked the beginning of their tragic and brutal end. Keith Dardeen, a 28-year-old truck driver, had always been a model of dependability. A hard-working father of 2 with a baby on the way, he had a steady job, a loving wife named Elaine, and 2 young children. Peter, his 3-year-old son, and a newborn daughter. He was known as a family man, involved in his community and his local church. His routine was predictable, so when Keith didn't show up for work that morning, it immediately set off alarm bells. His co-workers, surprised by his sudden absence, called his home several times but got no answer. This was unusual, even for Keith. It didn't take long before the concerns turned into something more. One of his colleagues, growing increasingly worried, made the decision to contact the authorities. When the police arrived, they were met with an eerie calm. The Dardeen home was quiet, too quiet, and there were no signs of a struggle, no obvious explanation for why Keith hadn't come in. The front door was locked, just as it always had been, with no sign of forced entry, but the moment the police stepped inside, they would soon realize that everything about this case would defy their understanding. Inside the house, the scene was as horrific as it was perplexing. There, in the living room, lay the bodies of Elaine and her 2 children. Elaine had been savagely beaten to death, her face bruised and unrecognizable, while little Peter was found lying beside her. His body was lifeless, showing the same signs of brutal violence. And then, to make this even more incomprehensible, a newborn baby girl was discovered in a crib in the same room, smothered with a pillow. The brutality of the crime shocked even the most experienced officers. The Dardeens, a quiet church-going family, had been massacred. But the most disturbing aspect was the lack of any clear motive. There was no sign of forced entry, no valuables missing. Everything appeared untouched. In a case like this, the police were trained to expect robbery or perhaps a personal vendetta. But this? It made no sense. The crime seemed senseless. The discovery was only the beginning of a growing mystery. Keith Dardeen, the father, was nowhere to be found. His absence added an eerie layer to an already chilling scene. Investigators began to search the area for any clues that might explain why he had been missing. Hours passed with no answers, until one of the officers made a startling discovery. Keith's car was found near the Benton police station, abandoned, with bloodstains on the seat. It was clear now that the case was even darker than they could have imagined. But the chilling part? Keith's body was discovered miles away from his home, dumped in a remote field. His body was found so far from the house that it seemed deliberate. A body left behind, discarded like trash. The brutality of Keith's death was just as horrifying as his family's. He had been shot in cold blood. It was clear that whoever did this didn't just want to kill, they wanted to send a message. The more the police pieced together the evidence, the more they were baffled. Why had Keith been executed so far from his home? Why had his body been disposed of like that? No one had heard or seen anything unusual. There were no witnesses, no leads, no sign of a struggle inside the home. Keith's death seemed to suggest that the killer wanted to erase him from the picture. perhaps so the Dardines wouldn't speak from the grave. The autopsies of the family revealed more chilling details: the lack of defensive wounds, the methodical nature of the killings. This wasn't the work of a stranger. The brutality suggested something more personal, even intimate. Was this someone close to the family? Or was this simply the act of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to strike? And yet, no evidence pointed to anyone in particular. There were no immediate suspects. No one had come forward to say they knew the family had any enemies. There were no signs of a financial motive, no signs of a troubled past. It was as if the killer had no reason at all, yet they still executed the family with a precision that made it feel like a planned execution. The crime scene was beyond anything the small town had ever seen. No one could make sense of the brutality, the violence, the lack of motive. There were no leads, no clear suspects, just an endless trail of confusion. The case was so perplexing that local law enforcement reached out for help. The FBI stepped in, and profiler after profiler analyzed the case, offering theories but no concrete answers. No one could understand why someone would do this to an innocent family. As the investigation dragged on, rumors began to spread. Some people spoke of a possible connection to a local drug dealer. Others whispered about the possibility of a violent, random killer passing through town. There were even murmurs of something darker, of a cult, of ritualistic violence. The police followed every lead, but with each dead end, the town's unease only grew. The investigation into the Dardine family murders began the moment their bodies were discovered, but what seemed like a straightforward case would soon turn into a tangled web of dead ends and unanswered questions. Authorities in the small town of Enna, Illinois had never encountered anything like this. When the bodies of Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the newborn were found, there were no signs of forced entry. The house wasn't ransacked, and nothing seemed to be stolen. The lack of a clear motive immediately raised red flags. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of violence. Detectives quickly realized the brutal nature of the murderers. Keith had been shot, Elaine and the children beaten mercilessly. But the most shocking detail? The killer had taken the time to hide their bodies. It was as if they wanted to send a message. But what message? In the first hours following the discovery, investigators scrambled to piece together the puzzle. Was this a targeted attack or an act of random violence? The police could find no signs of struggle inside the home, no signs that anyone had been forced to comply, no valuables were missing, no doors broken down. It was as though the family was not just killed, but personally singled out. But for what reason? The police's first leads took them straight to Keith's circle of friends and acquaintances. They interviewed co-workers, neighbors, and even distant family members. The more they spoke to people, the more questions emerged. Had Keith been involved in something dangerous? Had he made an enemy? Some speculated that perhaps his job had led him into a bad situation, but that theory quickly lost traction. Keith was a quiet man, a family man, and there was no history of him being involved in any shady dealings or criminal activity. But as investigators continued to dig, they uncovered something that didn't fit the mold of a random crime. Despite the brutal nature of the murders, there was an unsettling calmness to the crime scene. The killer hadn't left behind a frantic mess of blood or destruction. Instead, the bodies had been neatly arranged, almost as if the killer had taken their time. And worse still, there was a strange detail. The family's bodies had been left in a position that indicated a twisted sense of ritual. This wasn't an impulsive act of violence. This was calculated. In the early stages, the authorities pursued a wide range of suspects. They looked into the possibility of gang involvement, trying to connect the Dardines' deaths to a larger criminal network in the region. Investigators even considered a connection to local drug activity. But these theories fell apart just as quickly as they were formed. Every lead seemed to evaporate, leaving nothing behind but more questions. As the investigation stalled, the case took an unexpected turn. A breakthrough came when the police found a key piece of evidence in Keith Dardine's car. The vehicle was discovered parked near the Benton police station, a strange place for a man who was supposed to be miles away. Inside the car were signs of blood, and detectives quickly realized that Keith's body had been dumped after being shot. But it was the absence of any other physical evidence that threw them off. A pattern began to emerge. It seemed as if the Dardines were not killed at random, but with an intimate knowledge of their habits and routines. It was almost as if the killer had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The slaughter of the Dardeen family is more than a brutal crime. It's a mystery that refuses to be solved. A crime so violent, so inexplicable that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend what they were looking at. With no clear motive, no known enemies, and a scene that defied all logic, theories began to form. Some make sense, others stretch the boundaries of believability. But one thing is certain, somewhere out there, someone knows the truth. In 2000, more than a decade after the Dardeen murders, an unexpected name emerged: Tommy Lynn Sells, a drifter, a serial killer with a known appetite for chaos. He was already behind bars, convicted of other gruesome crimes. But then, he made a stunning claim: "I did it." Sells confessed to murdering Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the newborn baby. He described the crime in graphic detail, how he gained entry, what he used to kill them, the state of the bodies when he left. His confession sent shockwaves through investigators, but there was a problem. Some of his details were wrong. Tommy Lynn Sells was a pathological liar. He had a habit of inserting himself into crimes he didn't commit, either to inflate his reputation or to delay his execution by keeping law enforcement engaged in investigations. While he did describe some aspects of the case correctly, other parts of his story didn't align with the actual crime scene. He got certain timelines wrong, details about the family's belongings didn't match, and his version of how he entered the home didn't add up. But here's the most chilling part. Sells never recanted his confession. Even when faced with inconsistencies, even when his execution loomed, he held on to the claim that he was the killer. Was he truly the man responsible for wiping out the Dardeen family? Or was he just another killer desperate for the spotlight? The late 1980s was a time of paranoia. Satanic panic was sweeping across America. Stories of cults sacrificing victims, committing unspeakable acts in the name of dark rituals, were spreading like wildfire. When the Dardeen murders were revealed in their horrifying detail, the whispers began. This wasn't random. This was a ritual killing. A cult must be behind this. The extreme brutality, the overkill, and the targeting of an entire family fueled speculation that Keith had somehow crossed paths with the wrong people. Some believed he had refused an invitation to join a secret group, and this was their revenge. Others pointed to the fact that Elaine gave birth during the attack, a grotesque and tragic detail that led some to believe this was a planned, ceremonial event. But as terrifying as the theory was, it lacked one crucial thing: evidence. Investigators never found any links to a cult. No strange symbols, no ritualistic markings, no evidence of an organized group operating in the area. In the end, it seemed that the town's fear had taken on a life of its own. But still, some locals believed the real killers were never caught because they were protected by something larger than the law. Personal vendetta or mistaken identity? There was another theory, one much more intimate, much more personal. What if Keith was the real target? In the weeks before the murders, Keith expressed fear. He told his mother he was considering moving his family out of Ena, Illinois. Crime was on the rise and he was growing uneasy. But he never mentioned a specific threat, just a feeling. Was it possible he had angered someone? A jealous coworker? Someone from his past with unfinished business? Or worse, was it mistaken identity? Did someone come looking for another Keith? Another Dardeen? Was this entire massacre the result of an unforgivable mistake? There's no evidence to support these theories, but there's no evidence to rule them out either. A random act of violence, or a killer who was never caught. Sometimes the scariest possibility is also the simplest. What if the Dardeens were just in the wrong place at the wrong time? What if this was the work of a killer who has never been identified, a drifter, a stranger who entered their home, carried out the slaughter, and disappeared into the night, leaving behind no trace of their existence? It would explain the lack of motive. It would explain the excessive violence, someone killing for the sake of killing with no fear of getting caught. But there's a chilling thought that lingers. If this was a random act, then that means whoever did this could still be out there. It has been decades since the Dardeen family was wiped off the map. Keith's mother spent years fighting for answers, for justice, for someone to be held accountable, but no one ever was. Today, their case remains unsolved. A haunting reminder that sometimes there are no answers. No arrests, no justice, no closure. The Dardines deserved better. And somewhere out there, someone knows the truth. Do you? A family wiped out, a crime so ruthless it stunned even the most hardened investigators. Yet after decades, the case remains frozen in time. No answers, no justice, just silence. The confession of a serial killer once gave investigators hope, but inconsistencies and missing details left more questions than answers. Was Tommy Lynn Sells telling the truth? Or was he merely seeking notoriety for crimes he didn't commit? If not him, then who? Keith Dardine feared something terrible would happen. He wanted to leave, but he never got the chance. And the most chilling thought? The person responsible may have walked away, unseen, unnoticed, free. Some believe the killer was a drifter, vanishing into the night, never to be caught. Others think the truth is closer than we realize, buried beneath years of missed leads and forgotten evidence. But what do you think? Could this case still be solved? Or is the truth lost forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this case as disturbing as we did, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories unanswered, unsolved, and waiting to be told.